My name is Brian Mefford. I'm an American who's been living in Kyiv for 21 years. I've worked on different USAID projects, European Union projects, as well as for private companies and some government officials.
Also happy to be on the show. Danylo Korbabicz. I'm a government relations consultant based in Ottawa with over 10 years of experience in government here in Canada, and also act as a spokesperson for TIU Canada here in Canada. So the issue is twofold. The first one is obviously Ukraine has not been meeting its debt obligations on the payment of Ukrainian green energy tariffs. The second issue is legal in nature that TIU is currently experiencing in Ukraine.
So as you know, one of the things that Ukraine did to attract investment post-Euromaidan was they put in place a green energy law to attract investment, as well as to make sure that Ukraine would develop its own domestic sources of electricity using its solar and wind assets. So it was quite successful in that regard. More than almost $1 billion of North American capital has gone into Ukrainian green energy over the last few years, both from Canada and the US. And they've helped to develop wind and solar resources in Ukraine. Now, the agreement, though, is that Ukraine would build up its green energy sector to around 11% of its electricity production by 2020. They didn't quite make it. They got to about 7.5%. And then by 2025, they have a goal of, by 2030, they have a goal of reaching 25% of their electricity production through renewable energy sources. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is the government has to pay for it because you're not going to attract investment if you don't honor your commitments to investors. So the government's come in with, first of all, what is admittedly an attractive tariff regime. They had reductions in that regime put in place. So those who came in earlier got a higher tariff for a number of years, which is gradually reduced. In December 2018, the EBRD sounded the alarm bell, said actually the tariff's too high. This might be unsustainable for the Ukrainian government. Therefore, they encouraged the parliament to reduce the tariff, which they did. So there was a reduction in the tariff, but everyone continued. Things continued to move forward. Investment still came in record numbers in 2019, in fact. However, after the election of Zelensky in the autumn of 2019, the new Energy Committee chairperson, Mr. Garris, he started taking a very hostile view towards renewable energy. There's different reasons why that may be, but the reality is he's taken a very hostile view. At the same time, in September of 2019, Mr. Garris opened the door for Ukraine to begin importing Russian electricity again. So for the first time since 2015, Ukraine imported electricity, which is a bit contradictory because if you're working to wean yourself of Russian energy dependence, then you don't want to be buying up what is on the surface cheap Russian electricity, because it's never cheap. It always comes with a higher cost. So that continued. Then by March of 2020, the government essentially quit paying the producers for their green energy production. So the solar and wind and hydro producers were only receiving about 5 cents on the dollar for their electricity production. They're supposed to be paid every month. That stopped. And so for March, April, May, June, and July, the producers only received about 5% of their payments. That created a huge arrears of debt owed by the government to the industry of around $725 million. So that's a pretty significant amount of money for Ukraine. By June, the industry and the government had reached a compromise, which was later passed by Parliament, signed into law early August 2020. And what happened was it was a negotiation, a compromise, whereby the solar producers agreed to an additional 15% reduction in their tariff, and the wind producers agreed to a 7.5% reduction in their tariffs in exchange for the government paying their bills on time and then paying the arrears. So the government agreed to pay 40% of the arrears by December 31 of 2020, and then 15% quarterly, every 3 months in March, or starting in March 2021 and continuing through the end of this year. So far, since that time, the government has more or less paid their monthly bill. They run about 30 days late, but they're paying their bill on the monthly basis. As for the arrears, though, they were supposed to make the 40% debt payment. To date, they've only paid around 12% of that, and they have another 15% payment coming due in 30 days. So suffice to say, the government is still quite far behind on the payment of their debt arrears. So that's the background on the issue. I mean, the bigger issue is if Ukraine truly wants to attract investors, you have to honor the commitments you make to those investors.
Yeah, and I think that's also a good segue to another issue, which is the legal issue. The segue being that, of course, investors, the commitments to investors should be honored, but as part of that, as a corollary, impartial judicial system should be part of that as well. So just by way of background, the particular facility that's in question, the Nikopol facility, which is about 10.5 megawatts solar energy plant, it was the first investment under the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. So the plant was opened in 2018. It was commissioned January of 2018. Then towards the latter part of 2019, the company received a letter threatening disconnection from the grid. The facility itself is connected to a nickel ferroalloy plant that happens to be owned by notable oligarchs in Ukraine, the chief among them, Ihor Kolomoyskiy. At that point, the company refuses disconnection, and then by way of March of 2020, the disconnection takes place. And the disconnection has cost the company in excess of 1.5 million euros. This is on top of course, the issues that Brian describes, the general non-payment. Well, one thing to note is that the substation that feeds into the grid is located on the plant's property, right? So in order to feed into the grid, we need to go through that property in order to then garner the subsidies from the subsidies and the payment from the Ukrainian government. So there's that technicality. It has to travel, but nevertheless, there's an obligation on the part of the Ukrainian utility to ensure that the company can be properly connected and everybody's meeting their obligations. The broader point is that somebody has decided to target the company. As a result of that, obviously, we can get into the granular and we can get into the technicalities, but if somebody has a desire to go after you, they can go after you. And I think the broader point from a Western perspective is, I think in this particular case, the person instigating the attack has a desire to prove a point, both domestically and internationally. Perhaps it's to make a point that they can get away with it. Perhaps it's to showcase to the Ukrainian president that they continue to have some degree of leverage. From a Canadian point of view, yes, it has affected investment. And I think since that pronouncement by President Zelensky in 2019, you can go back and examine every single file that Zelensky highlighted, and it would be difficult to see any tangible progress in those files since that point in time. So all that to say is if you actually dug deep into all those bilateral on the Canadian side, I'm sure the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainian investors don't have much of an issue in Canada, but the Canadian investors in Ukraine, if you took a look at all those companies that were there at that conference and where they are in relation to their investment announcement, I would argue that it hasn't been going particularly well.
And keep in mind, last year, through the first 10 months of the year, Ukraine, by its own estimates, had about $220 million in foreign investment. To put that into context, Sudan had almost twice that amount over the same period of time last year. And obviously, Sudan has a long war-torn history, a tragic history, and and we can go on and on. But that just puts it into context. So that's the lowest amount of foreign direct investments in about 20 years in Ukraine. Now, a lot of that's due to COVID, obviously. It was a bad year economically for everyone, but it does put that into the larger context. If I know the President Zelensky's talked about investment nannies, great idea, but it would be better if those nannies would fix the problems that existing investors have, rather than try to entice new investors to Ukraine. Just in terms of possible solutions for the green tariff payment issue. Yes, of course, Ukraine doesn't have the vast financial resources and budget of the U.S. or Canada or even Western European nations. That being said, though, when you are in still a war phase with the Russian Federation, obviously don't buy electricity from Russia. That's something else I would add. The second thing is that you just have to honor your commitments to the investors. You can have any kind of spin or program you want, but unless you're going to honor the existing commitments and rule of law, then it's just a wasted effort. I mean, the American Chamber of Commerce, the Canadian Ukraine Chamber of Commerce, the UCC, which Danylo's been a board member of, U.S. Ukraine Business Council, the Ukrainian Association of Renewable Energy Producers, all have spoken out on this topic of the need for Ukraine to pay its green energy bill on time and to pay the debts. So that's good. So there's strong support across the board. I know the G7 ambassadors, certainly from the U.S. and Canada as well, have also raised this at different levels with the Ukrainian government. So among the officials in the Ukrainian government, they are aware of the issue. But again, it's about political will and prioritizing this issue. Now, one of the solutions that has been proposed was an idea by the Yuri Petrenko, who they are going to try to put up for a third vote to get confirmed as energy minister. And his idea was to do a carbon tax, because as you know, Ukraine has a lot of pollutive industries. And so the idea, just as in any other country, would be then to tax those heavy carbon industries and use that to pay for the green energy debts going forward. So that's a solution that might work, but it will take some time.
And just to add to that, with respect to that proposal, I mean, Ukraine will have to deal with it in some way, shape, or form at some level. As many countries are moving to a carbon tax, those countries will impose tariffs on imports. Part of Ukraine's trajectory, if it is to be in Europe, means selling to Europe. Europe is already talking about imposing tariffs on countries that do not have a carbon tax regime or a clean energy plan. So it's not only something that Ukraine should do for the sake of climate change. It is something that if they are interested in their trade surplus in the future, it's something they will have to address regardless of what is going on in the renewable energy industry.
Danylo, did you want to mention Senator Baker?
Right. So I will send this to you immediately after. But there have been a couple of statements of support from various groups in Canada. So obviously, naturally, the Canada-Ukraine Chamber has issued statements in the past of support of both the non-payment issue and the court issue. The UCC recently issued a statement in support of the company in relation to its court case, and last week the chair of the Canada-Ukraine parliamentary group, Yvonne Baker, also issued a statement issuing support for the company and its challenges. So it's created some. There's been some goodwill on the part of our Canadian interlocutors, and no doubt that will continue because it's fairly the way we see it, it's fairly cut and dry. I mean, it's a Canadian company. It's a company that's trying to grow the Ukrainian economy, and it's got a diasporan basis. So for all the right reasons, it's there. It wants to see Ukraine develop. But we're not part of the problem. We're part of the solution in Ukraine, and unfortunately, it's becoming harder and harder to become part of that solution.
Wonderful, much appreciated. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.